At Mercy Heights Medical Center, Cassie Green was a ghost. Not the kind you'd see on Halloween, but the kind you forget is even in the room. She was quiet, too quiet, and the hospital staff had no patience for it. Cassie kept to herself, moving from patient to patient without making a sound, her head always down, her eyes always averted. She wasn't part of the team. Not in their eyes. She didn't mind. She didn't need to be part of their world. She didn't care about the gossip, the rumors, or the occasional snide remark. She had her own reasons for being here. She just needed to survive another shift, get through another day without drawing too much attention. But the whispers were always there. In the halls. In the break room. Behind her back. Jess, the head nurse, was one of the worst offenders. Cassie? She's a joke, Jess would mutter whenever she thought Cassie wasn't listening. She flinches if you drop a bedpan. How did HR even clear her? She's a liability. Dr. Peter Hale, the ER specialist who prided himself on being the smartest person in the room, wasn't any better. If you want someone who can actually handle trauma, hire someone with some spine. Not a trembling rabbit. Cassie heard it all. But she never reacted. She never fought back. She couldn't. She wouldn't. It was easier this way. To be ignored. To be invisible. What they didn't know, what no one knew, was that Cassie wasn't just some nervous, shy nurse. Cassie Green had been someone else before this. Someone dangerous. Someone capable of saving lives in ways they would never understand. But that was a life she had left behind. The world didn't need her anymore. It was 2 a.m., the witching hour. The ER was packed, as usual, with patients suffering from car accidents, heart attacks, and everything in between. The overhead lights buzzed, and the sound of beeping monitors filled the air. Cassie stood at the nurse's station, quietly organizing patient charts. Her hands shook slightly as she flipped through the files, but that was nothing new. It had been like this for years, ever since the war. Hey, ghost. You planning on doing something today or just standing there looking like a deer in headlights? Jess's voice snapped Cassie out of her thoughts. Cassie didn't respond. She never did. Instead, she forced herself to focus on her work. It was Dr. Hale who always made her feel small, though. He was one of those people who walked the halls like he owned them. He had this arrogant confidence that rubbed everyone the wrong way, especially Cassie. He was used to being the best, being in charge. I swear, Hale said one day while signing off on a chart, if we had more competent nurses around here, maybe we wouldn't be so short-staffed. She's a joke. He didn't even look at Cassie as he said it. Cassie just nodded, pretending she hadn't heard him. She wasn't just a joke to him. She was a shadow. And that's exactly how she preferred it. A few hours later, chaos erupted. A multi-car crash on I-95 had flooded the ER. The waiting area was full, patients screaming in pain or fear, and doctors were scrambling to get control of the situation. It was the usual madness of the night shift, only worse. Cassie was assigned to Trauma Bay 3, a relatively minor case compared to the others. A construction worker, Mike, had been pulled from a crushed sedan. He was conscious, but clearly in pain. His vitals were stable, but the tension in his face told Cassie otherwise. He wasn't okay. Mike, hang in there, Cassie said softly, adjusting his fore. It's just bruising from the seat belt, Dr. Hale said dismissively, not bothering to look at the chart. Get him a chest x-ray when the machine opens up. Move him to the hallway when you're done. No, Cassie said firmly, looking at Mike's labored breathing. He needs a CT scan. His pulse is low, and he's struggling to breathe. We need to check for internal bleeding. Get real, Hale shot back. He's fine. Just bruising. Move him. Now. Cassie bit her lip, her mind racing. She knew better than this. She'd seen the signs before. She wasn't going to let him die from something so easily overlooked. She wasn't going to let another patient slip away because someone else refused to listen. Dr. Hale, with all due respect, you need to look at this again, she said, her voice low but commanding. Hale turned around, his eyes narrowing. What do you mean, look at this again? I'm the one in charge here. Not you. Cassie didn't flinch. She simply stared at him, her gaze unwavering. She wasn't just the nurse here. She had seen trauma before. She had saved lives in places far worse than this sterile hospital. His breathing is uneven, his heart rate is dropping. This isn't just bruising from a seatbelt. He has a tension pneumothorax. If we move him, he'll crash. Hale looked like he was about to argue, but before he could, Cassie grabbed the emergency chest tube kit and began preparing. It was then that the sound broke through. A low rumble. The unmistakable hum of a military helicopter. The noise was deafening. It wasn't like the usual medical choppers. This one was different. Dark. Heavy. Intense. A Blackhawk. The entire ER froze. Cassie's heart skipped a beat. She knew that sound, knew it better than she knew the beat of her own heart. The helicopter landed outside with a thundering boom, shaking the walls of the hospital. Staff scrambled, looking out the windows, unsure of what to do. This wasn't supposed to happen. The door slammed open, and 4 heavily armed men in tactical gear stepped into the ER. They weren't here for injured civilians. They weren't here for medevac. They were here for someone specific. Where is she? The voice was cold, hard, demanding. Who? Jess asked, trying to compose herself. The nurse. The one who just saved that man's life, the soldier growled. Cassie froze. She knew who they were asking for. She didn't want to be found. She didn't want to leave. But the moment those words left the soldier's mouth, everything changed. The other nurses stared at her, shocked. Dr. Hale was speechless. Cassie stood up slowly, her hands steady as she turned to face the soldiers. Is this about me? She asked, her voice quiet, but sharp. You're needed, the soldier said, his tone unwavering. You're the only one who can help. Cassie swallowed hard. She had been running from her past for so long, hiding behind the quiet life she'd built. But it was time to face what she had left behind. Cassie walked out of the ER, her shoulders straight for the first time in months. She hadn't been just a nurse in years. The weight of her past had always been there, lurking in the shadows. But now, as the helicopter blades roared back to life, it was undeniable. She was no longer just Cassie Green. Outside, the Blackhawk waited. Inside, Dr. Hale shouted. You can't just leave. You're not qualified to. Cassie didn't look back. She couldn't. This was her moment. She was ready. The Blackhawk's roar seemed to drown out everything around Cassie. Her heart was pounding, but her hands were still steady. The years of combat experience, the lives she had saved in war zones, all of it surged back in an instant. No more hiding. No more being the quiet, trembling nurse who got overlooked and belittled. She was Valkyrie again. She wasn't running from her past anymore, she was walking straight into it. Keep your head down, the soldier beside her instructed as the helicopter dipped lower. We don't know what we're walking into. Cassie nodded, though she wasn't looking at him. She was looking at Tex, the young man on the gurney beside her. His chest was rising and falling erratically, and his skin was already turning an unhealthy shade of gray. The blood soaking his uniform had darkened into a sticky, gruesome mess. His right side was a mess of jagged shrapnel and bullet wounds, and Cassie's heart clenched as she saw the deep gash in his neck. Cassie's hands trembled only for a split second as she reached for the combat trauma kit beside her. Then she calmed herself. This was familiar. This was what she had trained for. She had done this in the mountains of Afghanistan. She had done this on the flight line in Syria. But that was a lifetime ago. Her breath evened out, and she focused, her hands moving with surgical precision. The helicopter cut through the night sky like a blade, and the smell of gasoline and dust filled the air as they neared the base. Tex groaned in pain beside her, his eyes flickering open briefly before they closed again. His words were barely audible, but she caught them anyway. Not, again, Valkyrie, his voice was strained, almost pleading. Don't do this to yourself. Cassie closed her eyes, feeling the weight of his words. She hadn't been Valkyrie for over a year. She hadn't worn her combat boots or her field kit since the war had claimed her friends, had claimed her. But now, it was undeniable. Valkyrie was the only person who could save Texas. She was the only one with the knowledge and experience. She couldn't ignore it. She had to face the truth, she was still Valkyrie. She shook her head, clearing the fog that had settled over her mind for the last year. She wasn't going to let Tex die. Not like this. As the Blackhawk touched down, the whirling winds kicked up dust, sand, and debris, the sound of the rotors deafening. Cassie could barely hear herself think over the noise, but her instincts kicked in, just like they always did. The ground beneath her feet was shaky, but she moved with purpose, her military training guiding her every step. Tex was still unconscious, barely breathing, his pulse too weak to detect without the monitors. Stay with me, Tex, she whispered under her breath, though he couldn't hear her. The soldiers around her were moving quickly, preparing the stretcher to carry Tex into the field hospital. Cassie was focused entirely on him, watching his chest rise and fall, waiting for the moment where it would all go wrong if she didn't act fast enough. "Where is she?" one of the other soldiers barked. "Get her in here," another operator growled. His voice was low, but there was a sense of urgency behind it. Cassie walked past them, heading straight for the operating table. She had seen this all before: the sterile environment of the trauma bay, the bright lights overhead, the distant sounds of soldiers shouting orders, trying to maintain control. But it was different now. The chaos felt far more real, and the stakes had never been higher. Tex's body was placed gently on the table, and the moment the blood-soaked bandages were removed, Cassie froze. The injury to his neck was worse than she'd realized. The bullet had lodged itself right against the artery, and Cassie knew it wouldn't take long for the bleeding to be fatal. She could feel her pulse quicken, but she stayed calm. She had to stay calm. The team behind her scrambled, but Cassie wasn't waiting for instructions. "Stop," she commanded, her voice sharp and unwavering. Everyone in the room froze. Cassie's gaze never wavered as she assessed the situation. The soldiers, the medics, they were all waiting for her. "Get me the surgical tools," Cassie snapped, her voice a commanding presence in the room. "Now." One of the soldiers hesitated but quickly moved to fetch the necessary equipment. Cassie wasn't wasting time. The clock was ticking, and every second counted. She turned her attention back to Tex, studying the wound with a trained eye, knowing full well what needed to be done. "Valkyrie, we're ready," one of the medics said, his voice tense, but his hands were steady. Cassie nodded and immediately started the incision, her hands steady as she worked quickly and efficiently, each movement calculated. There was no room for error. The moment she made the incision, a low, guttural noise escaped her lips, the sharp pain in her chest returning as if it had never left. She could feel her past rushing back to her, the days spent on the front lines, the surgeries performed under fire, the lives lost, and the friendships that had never been the same since. But now, none of that mattered. She had to focus on Texas. He was still breathing, but for how much longer? "Clamp the artery," she ordered, her voice cold, focused. "We're not losing him." The medic beside her moved quickly to apply the clamp, and Cassie's fingers moved with terrifying precision as she worked the needle and thread into place, closing the wound. She wasn't thinking about the past anymore. She wasn't thinking about the trauma, the memories of war, or the way she had sworn she'd never pick up a scalpel again. Cassie Green had become Valkyrie once more. And Valkyrie never lost anyone. The minutes felt like hours as she worked, but she didn't stop. Her hands didn't tremble anymore. Every stitch, every adjustment, was done with the kind of care only someone who had been in the thick of battle could understand. She wasn't just saving a life. She was saving herself too. "How is he?" one of the soldiers asked, his voice tight with concern. Cassie didn't look up. "He's stabilizing," she said, her voice low but sure. "But we're not out of the woods yet." Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Cassie finished the final stitch. She stepped back, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she wiped her bloody hands on her scrubs. She felt the weight of exhaustion settle in, but there was a quiet sense of relief. Tex was going to make it. As she turned to face the soldiers, her eyes met Breaker's. His face was tired, his jaw clenched with the weight of the mission. He nodded at her, a silent acknowledgement of what she had just done. "Good work, Valkyrie," he said, his voice hoarse with respect. Cassie didn't smile. She didn't need to. The job was done. She had brought him back. But then, the doors to the trauma bay slammed open. Dr. Hale burst in, his face red with rage. "What is this?" he shouted. "Who authorized this? She's not even licensed. You can't just let her take over surgery." Cassie turned to him slowly, her gaze cold. "You have no idea what you're talking about, Dr. Hale," she said quietly. Her voice carried an authority she hadn't used in a long time. "I just saved his life. Now, you can either help me make sure he survives, or you can get out of the way." Dr. Hale didn't respond immediately. He stood there, mouth agape, looking like a man who had just realized the gravity of the situation. But Cassie didn't wait for his approval. She was done waiting. Cassie turned her attention back to Tex, who was now breathing steadily, his vitals stabilizing. She wiped her forehead with the back of her hand, and for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to relax. Valkyrie had returned. And the ghosts of her past? She had learned to control them.